When you're hauling freight across Nevada's endless highways in the dead of night, you quickly learn that the Silver State holds secrets darker than its desert shadows. For decades, long-haul truckers have whispered stories at truck stops and shared encounters over CB radios. Tales that defy explanation and chill the blood of even the most seasoned drivers. Tonight, we're bringing you 10 of the most terrifying encounters reported by truckers crossing Nevada's most haunted highways. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories. These are real accounts from real drivers who experienced something that changed their understanding of what lurks in the darkness beyond their headlight beams. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey through Nevada's most spine-chilling truck driver horror stories. Marcus Thompson had been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the road could throw at him. Whether breakdowns, aggressive drivers, wildlife, none of it fazed him anymore. But on a bone-cold February night in 2021, somewhere along the stretch of Highway 50 that locals call the loneliest road in America, Marcus would encounter something that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the world. He was hauling electronics from Reno to a distribution center in Denver, running ahead of schedule despite the late winter storm that had been threatening all day. The forecast called for heavy snow, but so far only scattered flakes had begun to dust his windshield. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Nevada desert, bordered by nothing but sagebrush and darkness. It was just past 2 a.m. when Marcus first noticed the lights in his rearview mirror. At first glance, they looked like any other truck's headlights, but something about them struck him as odd. They were too bright, almost bluish-white instead of the warm yellow of most headlights, and they maintained a perfectly constant distance behind him. When he accelerated, they accelerated. When he slowed down, they slowed down, never getting closer, never falling back. Marcus tried to get a better look through his side mirrors, but the glare was too intense. He couldn't make out the shape of the cab or even determine what type of vehicle was following him. The lights seemed to float in the darkness, disconnected from any earthly machine. A chill that had nothing to do with the February night began to creep up his spine. He grabbed his CB handset and keyed the mic, "Breaker 19. This is Freight Dog eastbound on the 50. Anyone else out here tonight?" Static answered him. He tried again, switching to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Nothing but the soft hiss of empty airwaves. The lights continued their ghostly pursuit for another 15 miles. Marcus found himself checking his mirrors obsessively, trying to understand what he was seeing. The vehicle, if it was a vehicle, never wavered in its position. It was as if it were tethered to his truck by an invisible rope, maintaining that same supernatural distance no matter what he did. Then, without warning, the lights began to multiply. First, there was a second set of lights beside the first, appearing as suddenly as if someone had flipped a switch. Then a third set and a fourth, until Marcus counted at least a dozen pairs of those eerie, blue-white beams spreading across the highway behind him like a phantom convoy. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as his heart began to race. The temperature gauge on his dashboard showed the engine running normally, but Marcus felt an otherworldly cold seeping into the cab. His breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the inside of his windows despite the heater running full blast. The CB radio crackled with static that almost sounded like voices, whispered words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with an inexplicable dread. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his rig up to 75 miles per hour on the empty highway. The convoy of lights matched his speed perfectly, maintaining their formation like ghostly escorts. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the growing cold in the cab. The logical part of his mind searched for explanations: military convoy, some kind of optical illusion, fatigue-induced hallucinations, but deep down, he knew he was witnessing something beyond normal understanding. As he crested a small hill, Marcus saw something that made his blood freeze. In the distance ahead, perhaps a mile down the highway, another set of those same blue-white lights was approaching from the opposite direction. But these weren't following the road. They were floating several feet above the asphalt, drifting toward him in perfect formation, like a parade of spirits returning from some midnight mission. The oncoming lights grew larger and brighter as they approached. Marcus could now see that there were at least 20 of them, arranged in a precise V formation that covered the entire width of the highway. They moved with a fluid, otherworldly grace that defied physics, their light casting no shadows on the desert floor below. Marcus realized he was about to be caught between two phantom convoys, one behind him and one ahead. Panic began to set in as he frantically searched for an escape route. There were no side roads, no rest areas, nothing but endless desert on both sides of the highway. He was trapped in a corridor of light that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of reality. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with a voice so clear it seemed to come from inside the cab itself. "Welcome to the night shift, driver." The voice was neither male nor female, carrying an echo that seemed to reverberate from some vast, empty space. "You've been chosen to witness the eternal convoy, the drivers who never completed their final run." Marcus tried to respond, but no sound came from his throat. The approaching lights were now close enough that he could see they weren't connected to any vehicles at all. They were simply points of brilliant light, each one pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own terrified heartbeat. As they drew nearer, he began to make out shapes within the light, the ghostly outlines of truck cabs and trailers, translucent and shimmering like mirages. The phantom convoy ahead of him began to spread out, creating a pathway down the center of their formation. Marcus realized they expected him to drive through their ghostly ranks. His foot eased off the accelerator as every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to do anything but continue forward into that supernatural gauntlet. But the lights behind him were drawing closer now, no longer maintaining their respectful distance. They pressed forward like shepherds herding him toward his fate. The temperature in the cab had dropped so low that ice was forming on the steering wheel beneath his grip. His breath came in short, visible puffs as the reality of his situation sank in. As Marcus entered the corridor of light created by the oncoming convoy, the world around him changed in ways that defied description. The desert disappeared, replaced by what looked like an endless highway stretching through a gray void. The stars vanished from the sky, leaving only the pale glow of the phantom trucks illuminating his path. He could hear the sound of diesel engines all around him, but they seemed to come from a great distance, muffled and distorted as if echoing through water. The ghostly trucks flanked him on both sides now, their translucent forms revealing the shadows of drivers who turned to look at him as he passed. Some raised spectral hands in greeting, while others simply stared with hollow eyes that seemed to hold the weight of eternity. Marcus tried to look away, but found himself drawn to their faces, each one telling a story of a journey that had ended far from home, far from loved ones, far from the rest they had earned. The voice on the CB spoke again, clearer now and seemingly coming from all directions at once. "Every night we make the run we never finished. Every dawn we fade back into the desert, waiting for darkness to call us home again. You've seen us now, driver. You're part of the convoy whether you choose to be or not." Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to wake up from what had to be a nightmare, but the cold metal of the steering wheel and the steady vibration of his engine assured him this was all too real. He was traveling through some supernatural realm, caught between the world of the living and the eternal highway of the dead. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The phantom trucks began to fade, their lights dimming until they were nothing more than distant stars. The desert returned around him, the familiar landscape of Nevada's Highway 50 stretching ahead, in the pale light of approaching dawn. The temperature in his cab slowly returned to normal, and the CB radio fell silent except for the gentle hiss of static. Marcus pulled over at the first rest area he found, his hands shaking as he shut down the engine. He sat in the growing daylight for nearly an hour, trying to process what he had experienced. When he finally started the truck again and continued his journey, he noticed something that made his blood run cold once more. His logbook showed that 4 hours had passed during what felt like only minutes in the Phantom convoy. 4 hours of his life had vanished into that supernatural encounter, leaving him with nothing but memories and the absolute certainty that he had glimpsed something beyond the veil of ordinary reality. But what haunted him most was the knowledge that somewhere out there, driving the lonely highways of Nevada in the darkest hours of night, that Phantom convoy was still running its eternal route, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to join their ghostly ranks. Sarah Mitchell had always prided herself on being one of the few female owner-operators who could handle any route, any cargo, and any challenge the road threw at her. In her 15 years behind the wheel, she'd navigated ice storms in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, and every kind of breakdown imaginable. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would encounter on Route 278, a remote stretch of Nevada highway that connects the small mining town of Carlin to the even smaller settlement of Tuscarora. It was mid-October 2020, and Sarah was hauling a load of mining equipment to a copper operation near Battle Mountain. The main highways were clogged with construction, so her GPS had routed her through the back roads, including a 40-mile stretch of Route 278 that wound through some of the most desolate country in Nevada. The 2-lane road cut through rolling hills covered in nothing but sagebrush and scattered juniper trees, with no cell phone coverage and no sign of human civilization beyond the occasional cattle guard. Sarah had been driving for about 6 hours when she entered the Route 278 stretch around 11 p.m. The night was clear and cold, with a full moon casting silver light across the desert landscape. She'd switched off her radio an hour earlier when the last station faded into static, leaving her with only the steady rumble of her diesel engine and the hypnotic rhythm of tires on asphalt. The isolation didn't bother her. She actually preferred the quiet back roads to the chaos of the interstates. About 20 miles into the Route 278 stretch, Sarah's headlights picked up something unusual on the road ahead. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or an elk that had wandered onto the pavement. But as she got closer and began to slow down, she realized it was a person. A woman in a white dress stood directly in the center of the highway, her back to Sarah's approaching truck. Sarah's first instinct was concern. Out here, 60 miles from the nearest town, finding someone on foot in the middle of the night usually meant car trouble or worse. She began to brake, pulling the air horn cord to alert the woman to get off the road. But the figure didn't move. She just stood there, perfectly still, as if she were made of stone. As the truck's headlights fully illuminated the scene, Sarah could see that the woman was young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair that hung down her back. Her white dress looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s, and it seemed to glow with an unnatural brightness in the harsh glare of the headlights. What struck Sarah as most unsettling was the woman's complete stillness. She didn't sway with the wind, didn't shift her weight, didn't show any of the small movements that mark a living person. Sarah brought her rig to a complete stop about 50 feet from the figure and set her air brakes. She grabbed her flashlight and opened the driver's door, calling out into the night air, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" Her voice echoed across the empty desert, but the woman didn't respond or even acknowledge her presence. The temperature outside was probably in the low 40s, but Sarah felt a chill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the October night. There was something wrong about the whole scene, something that made every instinct scream at her to get back in the truck and drive around the obstruction. but her concern for another person's welfare overrode her unease. "Miss, are you hurt?" Sarah called again, taking a few steps toward the figure. "There's no cell service out here. I can give you a ride to town or call for help on my CB." Still no response. The woman remained motionless, and Sarah began to notice other disturbing details. The white dress showed no signs of wind movement, despite the steady breeze that was rustling the sagebrush on both sides of the road. More unnaturally, the woman cast no shadow despite standing directly in the beam of Sarah's headlights. Sarah's unease deepened as she took another step closer. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint at first that she thought it might be the wind, but gradually growing louder and more distinct. It was crying, a woman's voice sobbing with a heartbreak so profound it seemed to carry the weight of decades. But the sound wasn't coming from the figure in the road. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the hills and seeming to rise from the very asphalt beneath Sarah's feet. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and Sarah realized it was transforming into something else. The sobs were becoming screams. Not screams of pain or fear, but screams of rage and loss so intense they seemed to claw at the very air. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, a combination of human anguish and something altogether more primal and terrifying. Sarah stumbled backward toward her truck, her flashlight beam wavering as her hands began to shake. The figure in the white dress still hadn't moved, but now Sarah could see that something was wrong with her posture. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if her neck had been broken, and her arms hung at her sides in a way that suggested death rather than sleep. The screaming reached a crescendo that made Sarah clamp her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate her skull directly, bypassing her physical senses entirely. It was the sound of a soul in torment, trapped between worlds and unable to find peace. And underneath the screaming, Sarah began to hear words, whispered in a voice that seemed to speak directly into her mind. "He left me here," the voice said, each word dripping with decades of accumulated fury. "Promised to come back, promised to take me away from this place. But he never came, never came, never came." The words repeated like a mantra, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. Sarah reached her truck and yanked open the driver's door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the supernatural screaming. But as she climbed into the cab, she made the mistake of looking back at the figure in the road. The woman had turned around. Her face was a mask of decay and rage, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to contain swirling darkness and a mouth stretched wide in an eternal scream. Her skin was pale as moonlight and seemed to glow with its own ghostly luminescence. But what horrified Sarah most was the recognition in that terrible face. This wasn't just any ghost. This was someone who had been waiting specifically for another woman to drive down this lonely road in the middle of the night. "You can't leave me too," the specter said, and though her lips moved, the voice came from inside Sarah's head. "No one leaves. No one gets to escape." The figure began to move toward the truck, not walking but gliding across the asphalt with impossible speed. Her white dress flowed around her like liquid light, and her broken neck rolled sickeningly as she moved. Sarah slammed the truck into gear and punched the accelerator, but the engine seemed sluggish, as if the truck were trying to move through thick mud instead of air. In her mirrors, she could see the ghostly woman pursuing her, moving faster than any living person could run, her arms outstretched and her mouth open in that endless, soul-piercing scream. The speedometer showed 40 miles per hour, then 50, but it felt like she was crawling. The screaming grew louder, and Sarah realized it wasn't just coming from behind her anymore. It was all around the truck, above it, below it, as if the very road had become a conduit for the spirit's anguish. The cab began to grow cold despite the heater running full blast, and frost started forming on the windows. Then Sarah felt something that nearly made her lose control of the truck entirely. There was a weight in the passenger seat, a presence so malevolent and filled with rage that it seemed to suck the warmth from the air. She didn't dare look to her right, but she could sense the ghostly woman sitting beside her, could smell the musty odor of decades-old decay and feel the unnatural cold radiating from her supernatural form. "Drive," the voice commanded, no longer screaming but speaking in a tone of deadly calm that was somehow even more terrifying. "Drive where he should have driven. Take me where he promised to take me." Sarah felt invisible fingers wrap around the steering wheel beside her own, guiding the truck off Route 278 and onto a dirt road she hadn't even noticed in the darkness. The dirt road was rough and narrow, clearly abandoned for decades. Sarah's headlights revealed the twisted remains of old fence posts and the rusted hulks of long-dead vehicles scattered along the roadside like automotive graveyards. The truck bounced and swayed as it navigated the deteriorating path, but the presence in the passenger seat kept the wheel steady, guiding them deeper into the Nevada wilderness. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the dirt road opened into a clearing where the remains of an old homestead stood, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. There was a collapsed barn, the foundation of a house, and what looked like an old gas pump standing sentinel over the ruins. Sarah's headlights illuminated rusted signs that advertised motor oil and cigarettes in brands that hadn't existed for 50 years. "Here," the voice said, and Sarah felt the weight leave the passenger seat. "This is where we were going to start our new life, where he promised we'd be happy." The temperature in the cab began to return to normal, and the oppressive presence that had filled the truck started to fade. Sarah looked in her mirrors and saw the ghostly woman standing in the clearing, no longer pursuing the truck but simply watching with those hollow, terrible eyes. Her white dress fluttered in a wind that Sarah couldn't feel, and her broken head lolled at that unnatural angle. But the rage seemed to have drained out of her, replaced by a sadness so profound it was almost palpable. "Every night," the spirit whispered, her voice now barely audible over the truck's engine. "Every night I wait for someone to take me home. But this is home now. This is where my story ends." Over and over again, the figure began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely, leaving only the ruins and the silence of the Nevada desert. Sarah sat in the clearing for several minutes, trying to process what had happened. When she finally built up the courage to turn the truck around and navigate back to Route 278, she found the main road exactly where she had left it. But according to her truck's odometer and the clock on the dashboard, she had somehow lost 3 hours in what felt like 30 minutes. She drove the remaining 20 miles to Battle Mountain in a daze, and it wasn't until she was checking into a motel room that she thought to look up the history of the area on her phone. What she found made her blood run cold. In 1953, a young woman named Elena Martinez had disappeared from Carlin, Nevada. She had been planning to elope with her boyfriend, who had promised to meet her on Route 278 and take her to California where they would start a new life together. Elena's body was found 3 weeks later in the ruins of an old homestead, about 5 miles off Route 278. She had died of exposure, apparently waiting for a lover who never came. The boyfriend was found dead in a car accident on Highway 80, killed while racing to meet her on the night of their planned elopement. According to the newspaper accounts, Elena had been wearing a white dress when she was found, and witnesses reported that she had been seen walking Route 278 on several occasions before her death, apparently looking for her missing lover. Sarah never took Route 278 again, always choosing the longer route through Battle Mountain even when it added hours to her journey. But she couldn't shake the memory of that broken, desperate figure in the white dress, or the knowledge that somewhere out there in the Nevada desert, Elena Martinez was still waiting for a ride that would finally take her home. For truck driver Tommy Rodriguez, Interstate 80 through Nevada was just another stretch of highway, a means to an end in his cross-country hauls between California and the East Coast. He'd driven it hundreds of times over his 12-year career, knew every truck stop, every way station, and every mile marker from Reno to the Utah border. It was familiar territory, as routine as brushing his teeth. But on a scorching July night in 2019, somewhere between Winnemucca and Battle Mountain, Tommy would discover that even the most familiar roads can harbor secrets that defy all logic and reason. Tommy was hauling a load of auto parts from Sacramento to Detroit, running slightly behind schedule due to a blown tire near Reno. The summer heat had been brutal all day, with temperatures reaching 115 degrees, and even now at midnight, the asphalt still radiated heat like a giant griddle. His air conditioning was working overtime, but the desert heat seemed to seep through every seal and gap in the cab, making the interior uncomfortably warm despite his best efforts to stay cool. The traffic was light at this hour, just the occasional eastbound truck and the rare passenger vehicle braving the desert crossing in the relative coolness of night. Tommy had his CB tuned to Channel 19, listening to the scattered chatter of other drivers reporting road conditions and sharing the lonely conversation that helps pass the miles. The radio was playing classic rock from a station out of Salt Lake City, and Tommy was settling into the meditative rhythm that long-haul drivers know well when something unusual caught his attention in the distance. At first, it looked like another truck with a really bright headlight, maybe one of those new LED arrays that some companies were installing on their fleet trucks. But as Tommy got closer, he realized the light was wrong somehow. It was too white, too intense, and it seemed to flicker and dance like a flame. When he was about a mile away, Tommy could see that the light wasn't coming from a headlight at all. It was coming from a person walking along the shoulder of the highway. Tommy's first thought was that someone was in serious trouble. Nobody walks Interstate 80 in the Nevada desert, especially not at midnight in July when the temperature was still over 100 degrees. Heat stroke could kill a person in minutes under these conditions. He began to slow down, reaching for his CB handset to report the situation to other drivers and maybe get someone to call for help. But as his headlights illuminated the walking figure, Tommy saw something that made him question his own sanity. The person, it appeared to be a man in work clothes, was completely engulfed in flames. Not flickering flames like from burning clothing, but a steady, intense fire that covered his entire body from head to toe. The man walked with a purposeful stride, seemingly unaffected by the fact that he was burning like a human torch. Tommy hit his brakes and brought the truck to a stop on the shoulder, about 100 feet from the burning figure. He grabbed his fire extinguisher and jumped out of the cab, expecting to find someone in desperate need of medical attention. But what he saw defied every law of physics and biology he thought he understood. The burning man continued walking eastbound along the highway shoulder, leaving no scorch marks on the asphalt, creating no smoke, and showing no signs of pain or distress. The flames that engulfed his body burned with a clean, white-hot intensity that hurt to look at directly, but they consumed nothing. His work clothes, what appeared to be a flannel shirt and jeans, remained intact beneath the fire, and his flesh showed no signs of burning or damage. "Hey!" Tommy called out, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The burning man stopped walking and slowly turned toward Tommy's voice. What Tommy saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. The man's face was perfectly normal, unmarked by flame or heat damage, but his eyes burned with the same white-hot fire that engulfed his body. When he looked at Tommy, those flame-filled eyes held an intelligence and awareness that was utterly human, but also something more, something that spoke of experiences beyond the realm of normal existence. The burning man raised one flaming hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, and when he spoke, His voice carried clearly across the desert air despite the crackling roar of the supernatural fire. "Still making the run," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if being completely engulfed in flames while walking down an interstate highway was the most natural thing in the world. "Got to finish the delivery. Promised I'd get it there on time." He turned back toward the east and resumed walking, his burning form creating a moving beacon of light against the dark Nevada landscape. Tommy stood frozen beside his truck, trying to process what he was witnessing. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations, hallucination brought on by fatigue, some kind of optical illusion created by heat mirages, maybe even an elaborate prank involving special effects. But the evidence of his senses was undeniable. He was looking at a man who was literally on fire, yet showed no signs of being harmed by the flames. The burning man had covered about 50 yards by the time Tommy gathered the courage to follow him. He climbed back into his truck and slowly drove along the shoulder, keeping pace with the walking figure. Through his side window, he could see incredible details that only deepened the mystery. The flames that covered the man's body moved and danced like real fire, but they cast no heat that Tommy could feel even when he opened his window. More disturbing, the man's shadow on the highway was completely normal, just the shadow of a walking person, with no indication of flame or unusual light. Tommy grabbed his CB handset and keyed the mic, "Breaker 19. This is Desert Hawk eastbound on 80 at mile marker 220. Anyone else seeing what I'm seeing out here?" The radio crackled with static, then a voice responded from somewhere ahead on the highway. "What you got, Desert Hawk? Road conditions looking pretty clear from where I sit." The voice belonged to another trucker, probably a few miles east of Tommy's position. "There's a guy walking the shoulder," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice steady. He's on fire, completely engulfed in flames, but he's just walking along like nothing's wrong. You copy that?" Long pause, then, "Say again, Desert Hawk? You said a guy on fire." "That's affirmative. White male, work clothes, walking eastbound on the shoulder near mile marker 220. He's burning like a torch but doesn't seem to be hurt. I don't know what to make of it." Another voice joined the conversation, this one older and more gravelly. "Son, you been driving too long without a break? Maybe you should pull over and get some rest. Ain't nobody walking 80 in this heat, and there sure ain't nobody on fire out there." Tommy looked out his window at the burning man, who continued his steady eastbound pace as if he were simply commuting to work. "I'm looking right at him," Tommy insisted. "He's maybe 20 feet from my truck, burning head to toe but walking normal as you please." The CB fell silent for a moment, then the older voice came back. "Desert Hawk, I'm about 2 miles ahead of your position, and I ain't seeing nothing on the shoulder. Maybe you should call it a night. Get yourself checked out." Tommy realized that somehow, impossibly, he was the only one who could see the burning man. This realization was almost more unsettling than the supernatural encounter itself. Why him? What made him special or cursed enough to witness something that apparently existed outside normal reality? He continued to pace the walking figure for another mile, studying every detail and trying to understand what he was seeing. The burning man never looked back at the truck, but occasionally he would gesture with one flaming hand, pointing at something in the distance that Tommy couldn't see. Sometimes he would move his lips as if talking to someone, carrying on what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with an invisible companion. As they approached mile marker 225, the burning man suddenly stopped walking and turned to face Tommy's truck directly. Those flame-filled eyes met Tommy's through the passenger side window, and for a moment, Tommy felt a connection to something vast and terrible and utterly beyond human understanding. The burning man raised both hands and pressed them against the window, and Tommy could see the perfect detail of his palms and fingers outlined in fire. 23 years, the burning man said, his voice somehow audible even through the closed window and over the sound of the truck's engine. 23 years since the accident. Still got to make the delivery. Still got to finish the run. His expression was one of infinite sadness mixed with grim determination. Some promises don't end with death, driver. Some commitments follow you into whatever comes next. Tommy found his voice enough to ask, "What accident? What delivery?" But the burning man was already stepping away from the truck, moving toward the center of the highway. He stood in the eastbound lane for a moment, those terrible, beautiful flames dancing around his form. Then he simply faded away like morning mist, leaving nothing but the empty highway and the oppressive Nevada heat. Tommy sat on the shoulder for nearly an hour, trying to convince himself that he had experienced some kind of heat-induced hallucination. But he couldn't shake the memory of those flame-filled eyes or the weight of sadness in the burning man's voice. Finally, he put the truck back in gear and continued east, but the remaining miles to his next fuel stop passed in a blur of confused thoughts and racing pulse. At the truck stop in Battle Mountain, Tommy decided to do some research. The old-timer behind the counter knew the highway like the back of his hand, had been working truck stops along I-80 for over 30 years. When Tommy described his encounter, the man's weathered face went pale. "Jesus Christ," the old-timer whispered. "You saw Billy Hartman." He poured himself a cup of coffee with shaking hands and sat down heavily on a stool behind the counter. "That was 23 years ago, maybe 24 now. Billy was hauling chemicals, some kind of industrial solvent, from Reno to Salt Lake City. Middle of July, just like tonight. Hot as hell and getting hotter." Tommy felt his stomach clench as he sensed where the story was heading. What happened to him? Truck caught fire just east of Winnemucca. Billy was trapped in the cab when the whole rig went up like a Roman candle. They say the chemical cargo burned so hot it melted the asphalt for 50 feet in every direction. Billy was still alive when the first responders got there, but there wasn't nothing they could do. Poor bastard burned to death trapped behind the wheel, and the worst part was he kept talking the whole time. Kept saying he had to make his delivery, had to finish the run. Died still trying to reach for the gear shift. The old-timer took a long sip of his coffee and stared out the window at the dark highway. Ever since then, drivers report seeing him walking the highway, always heading east, always on fire. Most folks don't see him, but every few years someone does. Always the same story. Man in work clothes, completely engulfed in flames but not being consumed by them. Legend says he's still trying to make that delivery, still trying to finish the run that killed him. Tommy's hands were shaking as he paid for his fuel and headed back to his truck. The remainder of his journey to Detroit passed without incident, but he found himself constantly checking his mirrors and scanning the highway shoulders, half expecting to see that burning figure continuing his eternal walk along Interstate 80. Years later, Tommy still drives that stretch of highway, but never again in July and never again at night. He's learned that some roads carry more than just traffic. They carry the unfinished business of the dead, the promises that bind souls to the asphalt long after their bodies have been consumed by fire and time. And somewhere out there in the Nevada desert, Billy Hartman is still walking, still burning, still trying to complete the delivery that cost him his life but couldn't break his commitment to finish the run. Linda Patterson had been driving long haul for nearly 18 years, and she thought she'd heard every possible sound a highway could make. The whistle of wind through mountain passes, the echo of engine noise bouncing off canyon walls, the rhythmic thumping of expansion joints on concrete bridges. All of it was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. But on a moonless September night in 2018, while navigating the treacherous curves of Highway 6 through Devil's Gate Pass, Linda would encounter sounds that had nothing to do with physics or engineering and everything to do with a tragedy that happened decades before she was born. Linda was hauling a load of furniture from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the scenic route through central Nevada to avoid construction delays on the interstates. Highway 6 was a beautiful drive during the day, winding through mountain passes and high desert valleys that most tourists never saw. But at night, especially on a moonless night like this one, the two-lane highway became a challenging ribbon of asphalt that demanded complete attention and respect. Devil's Gate Pass was the most treacherous section of the route, a series of hairpin turns that climbed through a narrow canyon between towering rock walls. The locals had named it well. The jagged rocks jutting from the canyon walls looked like the teeth of some massive predator, and the way the wind howled through the pass on stormy nights could raise the hair on the back of your neck. But tonight was calm, with no wind at all, which made what Linda was about to experience even more unsettling. She had just entered the pass around 1:30 a.m. when she first heard the voices. At first, she thought it was her CB radio picking up some distant transmission, maybe truckers chatting on a different channel. But when she checked, the radio was turned off, and she hadn't heard the characteristic squelch and static that preceded CB conversations. The voices seemed to be coming from outside the truck, carried on the still night air. They were children's voices, she realized, high and clear and filled with what sounded like excitement or joy. Linda couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Kids at play, laughing and calling to each other the way children do during recess or at a playground. The sound was so out of place in this remote mountain pass that Linda immediately slowed down, thinking perhaps there was a broken-down family vehicle ahead and children were standing on the roadside. But her headlights revealed nothing except the narrow highway winding between the canyon walls. No vehicles, no people, no explanation for the voices that continued to drift through her open window with startling clarity. Linda rolled up the window and turned on her air conditioning, thinking the sound might be some kind of acoustic trick caused by the canyon walls and her open window creating a wind effect. But even with the windows sealed, she could still hear the children's voices, now seeming to come from inside the truck itself. The voices grew louder as she navigated the first series of hairpin turns. Now she could make out individual words and phrases, "Over here," and "Come play with us," and "Don't go yet." The voices were definitely those of children, ranging from what sounded like 5 or 6 years old up to perhaps 12 or 13. Boys and girls both, their voices overlapping and interweaving in a chorus of youthful excitement that would have been delightful under normal circumstances but was absolutely terrifying in this isolated mountain pass at nearly 2 in the morning. Linda's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she tried to focus on the challenging road ahead. The curves were sharp enough that her headlights would illuminate nothing but rock wall on one side and empty air on the other, with the actual roadway invisible until the last moment. It was the kind of driving that required total concentration, but the children's voices were making that impossible. "Linda," one of the voices called out, and her blood turned to ice. The voice was that of a young girl, maybe 8 years old, and she had spoken Linda's name with the casual familiarity of a friend. "Linda, why won't you stop and play with us? We've been waiting so long for someone to play with." Linda had never told anyone her name on this route. She was running solo, hadn't stopped for fuel or food since leaving California, and hadn't spoken to another human being in hours. There was no way these disembodied children's voices could know her name unless something supernatural was happening. She grabbed her CB handset and keyed the mic, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Breaker 19. This is Mountain Mama on Highway 6 eastbound through Devil's Gate. Anyone else on this channel?" Static answered her. She tried again on channel 17, then 21, but received no response. Either she was completely alone on this stretch of highway, or something was interfering with her radio communications. The children's voices continued their supernatural chorus, now seeming to come from all directions at once. They were getting more insistent, more demanding. "Stop the truck! "Linda, come play hide and seek. We know the best hiding places." Their tone was still playful, but underneath the childish excitement, Linda detected something else. A desperate longing that made her heart ache despite her growing fear. As she navigated another sharp curve, Linda's headlights briefly illuminated something that made her slam on the brakes. For just a moment, silhouetted against the canyon wall, she saw the shapes of children playing. They were translucent, barely visible, but definitely there. Perhaps a dozen kids of various ages, running and laughing and pointing at her truck. But when her headlights steadied on the spot, there was nothing but bare rock and shadow. "We see you too, Linda," the young girl's voice said, now coming from directly beside the driver's seat, as if a child were sitting in the passenger seat. "We see your pretty truck with all the lights. Will you give us a ride? We've been walking for such a long time, and we're getting tired." Linda forced herself to release the brakes and continue driving, but her entire body was shaking now. The temperature inside the cab had dropped noticeably, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The children's voices surrounded her completely now, creating a supernatural symphony of youthful chatter that seemed to resonate through her bones. "Tell us a story, Linda," a boy's voice requested from somewhere near the ceiling of the cab. "Tell us about the places you've been. We haven't been anywhere in so long. We just stay here in the canyon, waiting for people to visit us." Despite her terror, Linda found herself feeling profoundly sad for these disembodied children. There was such loneliness in their voices, such hunger for human contact and attention. Whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they seemed to be trapped in this remote canyon, desperate for interaction with the living world. But her sympathy was tempered by a growing sense of danger. The children's requests were becoming more insistent, and Linda sensed that they weren't just asking for stories or conversation. They wanted her to stop, to get out of the truck, to join them in whatever limbo they inhabited. And something told her that if she gave in to their pleas, she might never leave Devil's Gate Pass. "Please, Linda," the young girl's voice pleaded, now sounding as if it were coming from right inside Linda's head. "We're so lonely. Nobody ever stops to play with us anymore. The old highway used to have lots of cars, but now hardly anyone comes through here. Please don't leave us alone again." Linda's heart broke a little at the desperation in that child's voice, but she forced herself to keep driving. The curves were becoming less severe now as she approached the eastern end of the pass, but the children's voices were becoming more frantic, more demanding. "You can't leave," a boy's voice shouted, filled with anger and disappointment. "Nobody leaves. You have to stay and play with us. You have to." The temperature in the cab dropped even further, and Linda's windows began to fog with frost despite the warm September night outside. That's when Linda saw them clearly for the first time. In her rearview mirror, illuminated by her trailer's running lights, she could see dozens of children standing in the road behind her. They were translucent but clearly visible, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, all wearing clothing that looked decades out of date. Their faces were pale and sad, and they were all waving goodbye with the resigned disappointment of children who had been left behind once again. The sight was so heartbreaking that Linda almost stopped the truck. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to harm her. They were just children who had been trapped in this lonely place, desperate for human contact and companionship. But something in their eyes, a hunger that went beyond simple loneliness, warned her that stopping would be a mistake she might not survive. As she cleared the final curve and emerged from Devil's Gate Pass into the open desert beyond, the children's voices began to fade. Their last words followed her like an echo. "Come back, Linda. Please come back and play with us. We'll be waiting. We'll always be waiting." The temperature in the cab slowly returned to normal, and Linda's windows cleared. She drove for another hour before she felt safe enough to stop at a truck stop in Tonopah. where she spent the rest of the night researching the history of Devil's Gate Pass on her phone. What she found confirmed her worst fears. In 1962, a school bus carrying 23 children from a small mining camp had lost its brakes while navigating the treacherous curves of Devil's Gate Pass. The bus had crashed through the guardrail and plunged into the canyon, killing all 23 children and the driver instantly. The mining camp was abandoned shortly after the tragedy, and the old highway was eventually rerouted to bypass the most dangerous sections of the pass. But according to local legend, the children never left. For decades, drivers had reported hearing children's voices in Devil's Gate Pass, seeing ghostly figures playing along the roadside, and experiencing sudden temperature drops and equipment malfunctions. Most dismissed these reports as imagination or fatigue, but a few drivers, like Linda, had encountered the supernatural directly and lived to tell about it. Linda never drove Highway 6 through Devil's Gate Pass again. She couldn't bear the thought of those lonely children waiting in the canyon, desperate for someone to stop and play with them, trapped forever in their final game that no living person could safely join. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, she swears she can still hear their voices calling her name, asking her to come back and keep them company in their eternal childhood that exists somewhere between life and death in the shadows of Devil's Gate. For truck driver Jake Morrison, Highway 95 through southern Nevada was a routine run, a straight shot through the desert that connected Las Vegas to the agricultural regions of Central California. He'd driven it monthly for over 8 years, hauling produce and manufactured goods between the West Coast and the casinos, and he knew every truck stop, every rest area, and every mile marker along the 300-mile stretch. It was familiar territory, as predictable as sunrise, which made his encounter on a sweltering August night in 2021 all the more disturbing. Jake was heading north from Las Vegas to Reno with a load of casino supplies, slot machines, gaming tables, and boxes of chips destined for a new tribal casino near Lake Tahoe. He'd left Vegas around 10 p.m. to avoid the worst of the desert heat. But even at midnight, the temperature outside was still hovering near 105 degrees. The air conditioning in his 2018 Peterbilt was working overtime, and he'd already gone through 2 bottles of water in the first 100 miles. The highway was relatively quiet for a Saturday night, with just the occasional passenger car heading to or from Las Vegas and the steady flow of commercial traffic that never really stopped in Nevada. Jake had his CB tuned to Channel 19, listening to the scattered chatter of other drivers reporting road conditions and weather updates. The radio was playing country music from a station out of Las Vegas, and Jake was settling into the meditative rhythm that helps pass the long desert miles. About 40 miles north of Las Vegas, near the tiny settlement of Mercury, Jake noticed something unusual in his passenger side mirror. There appeared to be another truck following him, maintaining a steady distance of maybe a quarter mile. Nothing strange about that. Truckers often travel in loose convoys for safety and companionship on long desert runs. But something about this particular truck struck Jake as odd. The truck's headlights were perfectly aligned with his own, matching his speed exactly and maintaining that precise distance with an accuracy that seemed almost mechanical. When Jake sped up to pass a slower vehicle, the following truck accelerated at the same moment. When he slowed down for a construction zone, the truck behind him decelerated with perfect synchronization. It was as if the 2 vehicles were connected by an invisible tether. Jake tried to get a better look at the following truck through his mirrors, but the glare from its headlights made it impossible to see any details of the cab or trailer. The lights themselves seemed unusually bright, almost blindingly white, and they cast strange shadows that didn't seem to align with the surrounding landscape. More unsettling, the truck appeared to be traveling without running lights or marker lights, just those 2 brilliant headlights floating in the darkness like disembodied eyes. After about 20 miles of this synchronized travel, Jake decided to test his theory. He gradually reduced his speed from 70 miles per hour to 60, then to 50, watching his mirrors carefully. The following truck matched his deceleration perfectly, never getting closer, never falling back. When Jake accelerated back to highway speed, the mysterious truck kept pace with the same supernatural precision. Jake grabbed his CB handset and keyed the mic, "Breaker 19. This is Neon Cowboy northbound on 95 near mile marker 120. Got a truck behind me," wondering if the driver's monitoring this channel. He waited for a response, but heard only static. He tried again on channel 17, then switched to channel 21, but received no answer from the following truck or any other driver in the area. The lack of response bothered Jake more than he cared to admit. In his 8 years of driving this route, he'd never encountered a trucker who wouldn't respond to a friendly radio call, especially on a long, lonely stretch like Highway 95. The trucking community was generally social and helpful, always ready to share road conditions or just pass the time with conversation. A trucker who ignored CB calls was unusual, and when combined with the strange behavior of the following truck, it suggested something was very wrong. As they passed the town of Beatty, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. In his passenger side mirror, he could see not just the headlights of the following truck, but what appeared to be a reflection of his own cab. The mysterious truck wasn't just following him. It was somehow mirroring his every action with perfect precision. When Jake raised his hand to adjust his rearview mirror, he could see the driver of the following truck make the exact same gesture at the exact same moment. Jake's hands began to shake as the implications sank in. He was looking at himself, or rather, at some supernatural reflection of himself driving a ghostly duplicate of his own truck. The following vehicle wasn't just matching his speed and movements, it was duplicating them with the precision of a mirror image. When Jake turned his head to look out the driver's side window, the figure in the following truck turned its head in the opposite direction, maintaining perfect symmetrical movement. The temperature inside Jake's cab began to drop despite the desert heat and the air conditioning system working normally. Frost started forming on his mirrors, and his breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. The radio began picking up static that almost sounded like whispered conversations, words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. Jake tried to break the supernatural synchronization by making sudden, random movements. He jerked the steering wheel slightly to the left, then quickly corrected. In his mirror, he saw the following truck make the exact opposite movement at the exact same instant, steering right and then correcting with mechanical precision. When Jake reached for his coffee cup, the mirror driver reached in the opposite direction. When he scratched his chin with his left hand, the mirror figure used its right hand to make the identical gesture. The realization that he was being followed by some kind of supernatural doppelganger was terrifying enough, but what happened next nearly caused Jake to lose control of his truck entirely. The mirror figure turned to look directly at him, and Jake found himself staring into his own face. But it was wrong somehow, like looking at a photograph negative. The features were his own, but the expression was cold and alien, and the eyes held an intelligence that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The mirror Jake raised one hand and pressed it against what appeared to be the inside of his windshield, as if there were invisible glass separating them. Jake felt compelled to do the same, raising his own hand to match the gesture. For a moment, they sat there like mirror images, separated by a quarter-mile of highway but somehow connected by an invisible barrier that existed outside the normal laws of physics and reality. The mirror Jake's mouth began to move, and though no sound came through the CB radio or the night air, Jake could somehow understand what his doppelganger was saying. The words formed directly in his mind, spoken in his own voice but carrying an echo that seemed to come from some vast, empty space. "You can't outrun yourself, Jake. You can't escape what you've done." Jake's heart raced as fragmented memories began surfacing. Memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. 3 years ago, on this same stretch of Highway 95, he'd been driving tired after pulling a double shift. He dozed off for just a few seconds, but it had been enough. His truck had drifted across the center line, and only the quick reflexes of an oncoming driver had prevented a head-on collision. The other vehicle, a small sedan with a family inside, had swerved into the desert and rolled multiple times. Jake had stopped, had called 911, had done everything he was supposed to do. The family survived with minor injuries, and the investigation cleared Jake of any wrongdoing. The accident was ruled a result of fatigue, something that could happen to any driver. But Jake had never forgiven himself for those few seconds of inattention that had nearly killed innocent people. The guilt had been eating at him ever since, manifesting in insomnia, anxiety, and a growing sense that someday he would have to pay for his moment of carelessness. "You remember now," the mirror Jake said, his lips moving in perfect synchronization with the words forming in Jake's mind. "You remember what you almost did, what you still might do. Every night you drive this highway, you're gambling with other people's lives. Every time you get behind the wheel when you're tired, when you're distracted, when you're not giving the road your complete attention." The mirror truck began to move closer, closing the gap between them with deliberate slowness. Jake could see more details now. It was indeed an exact duplicate of his own rig, down to the company logos and the small dent in the front bumper he'd gotten at a loading dock in Phoenix. But everything was reversed, as if he were looking at his truck through a mirror, and the closer it got, the more wrong it looked. The mirror Jake's face was becoming clearer now, and Jake could see that while the features were identical to his own, there was something subtly different about the expression. This version of himself looked tired beyond measure, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression that spoke of sleepless nights and accumulated guilt. It was Jake as he might become if he continued to carry the weight of his near-miss accident without finding a way to forgive himself. "Pull over," the mirror Jake commanded, his voice now carrying a tone of authority that Jake felt compelled to obey. "It's time to face what you've been running from. Time to accept the consequences of your carelessness." The mirror truck was now only about 50 yards behind, close enough that Jake could see his doppelganger's hands on the identical steering wheel, see the same company shirt he was wearing, see the coffee-stained logbook on the passenger seat. Jake fought against the compulsion to pull over, recognizing that giving in to his supernatural pursuer might mean more than just a confrontation with his own guilt. There was something predatory about the mirror Jake, something that suggested this encounter was about more than just psychological torment. The mirror figure seemed to want to replace him, to take over his life and his route, leaving the real Jake trapped in whatever limbo existed between the physical world and the realm of guilt and regret. Instead of pulling over, Jake pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck up to 80 miles per hour despite the desert heat and the strain on his engine. The mirror truck matched his acceleration instantly, maintaining its position like a supernatural shadow. But as Jake's speed increased, he noticed something encouraging. The mirror image was becoming less stable, flickering like a bad television reception. The faster he drove, the more difficult it seemed for his doppelganger to maintain the perfect synchronization. The mirror Jake's expression changed from commanding authority to frustrated anger as his supernatural hold began to weaken. "You can't run forever," he snarled, his voice now carrying a distortion that made it sound less human and more like something trying to imitate human speech. "Every time you close your eyes, I'll be there. Every time you look in a mirror, you'll see me. Every time you drive this highway, you'll remember what you almost did and what you still might do." Jake pushed his truck even harder, reaching speeds that were dangerous for the desert highway but necessary to break free from his supernatural pursuer. The mirror truck began to lag behind, its perfect synchronization finally breaking down as the laws of physics reasserted themselves over whatever supernatural force had been driving the encounter. The image flickered more violently now, like a candle flame in a strong wind, and Jake could see his doppelganger struggling to maintain control of his ghostly vehicle. As Jake crested a small hill near the town of Goldfield, he looked back to see the mirror truck one last time. It was falling rapidly behind now, its headlights dimming and its form becoming translucent. The mirror Jake raised one hand in what might have been a farewell gesture or a final threat, and then both truck and driver faded away like morning mist, leaving only the empty highway and the normal sounds of Jake's engine and tires on asphalt. Jake didn't slow down until he reached the truck stop in Tonopah, where he sat in his cab for nearly an hour, trying to process what had happened. The encounter with his mirror self had forced him to confront the guilt he'd been carrying for three years, but it had also shown him something important. The accident that haunted him had been just that, an accident. He'd made a mistake, but he'd learned from it, had become a more careful and attentive driver because of it. The mirror Jake had represented not redemption or justice, but the destructive power of unresolved guilt. The way self-blame can become a prison that traps you in an endless cycle of regret and self-punishment. By refusing to pull over, by refusing to give in to his supernatural doppelganger's demands, Jake had rejected that prison and chosen to move forward with his life. Jake still drives Highway 95 regularly, but he's never again encountered his mirror self on that desert highway. He's learned to forgive himself for his moment of human fallibility while remaining vigilant about the responsibilities that come with operating an 18-wheeler. And sometimes, when he's feeling the weight of fatigue or distraction, he remembers that night and the choice he made to keep driving forward instead of being trapped by his own reflection in the supernatural mirror of guilt and regret. Danny Kowalski had been driving truck for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never encountered a stretch of highway that felt as spiritually charged as US Route 445 along the shores of Pyramid Lake. The ancient lake, sacred to the Paiute people and surrounded by otherworldly rock formations, had always given him an uneasy feeling, but he chalked it up to the isolation and the stark beauty of the landscape. On a cold November night in 2020, however, Danny would discover that his unease was more than justified, and that some places hold echoes of the past that refuse to stay silent. Danny was hauling a load of construction materials from Reno to a mining operation near Gerlach, taking Route 445 north along the western shore of Pyramid Lake. It was a route he'd driven dozens of times, but never at night and never in weather like this. A late-season storm was moving in from the Sierra Nevada, bringing with it the promise of the first snow of winter and winds that rocked his 18-wheeler despite its heavy load. The lake stretched away to his right, its dark waters reflecting the few stars that showed between the racing clouds. Pyramid Lake was one of the most ancient bodies of water in North America, a remnant of the massive prehistoric Lake Lahontan that had covered much of Nevada during the last ice age. The Paiute people considered it sacred, and Danny had always respected that reverence, even if he didn't fully understand it. Tonight, however, he was beginning to sense the spiritual power that his Native American friends had tried to explain to him. It was just past midnight when Danny's CB radio began acting up. At first, it was just static, the kind of atmospheric interference that often accompanied storms in the mountains. But as he drove north along the lake's shore, the static began to resolve into something that sounded almost like voices. Not the clear, immediate voices of other truckers, but distant, echoing sounds that seemed to come from very far away, both in space and time. Danny adjusted his squelch and tried different channels, but the voices persisted across the entire CB spectrum. They spoke in what sounded like a Native American language, words he couldn't understand but that carried an unmistakable tone of urgency and distress. Sometimes there would be single voices, sometimes multiple speakers talking over each other, creating a cacophony of supernatural communication that made Danny's skin crawl. He tried to raise other drivers on the radio, but his transmissions seemed to be absorbed by the storm and the strange voices. When he keyed his mic, the native voices would briefly quiet, as if they were listening to him, but they never responded in English and they never acknowledged his presence directly. Instead, they would resume their urgent, incomprehensible conversations, their words carrying an emotional weight that transcended language barriers. As Danny navigated a curve that brought him closer to the lake's edge, the voices on his radio were suddenly joined by others. These new voices spoke in English, but they were faint and distorted, as if they were broadcasting from some great distance or through layers of interference. Danny strained to make out the words, and what he heard made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Can't find the way back," came a voice that sounded like an older man, crackling with static and desperation. "Been driving for hours. The road just keeps going around the lake. Can't find the turnoff." Another voice, this one belonging to a woman, joined the ghostly transmission. "The water's getting higher. It's coming up over the highway. We're trapped between the lake and the mountains. Can anyone hear us?" Danny grabbed his CB handset and keyed the mic. "Breaker? Breaker. This is Mountain Express on Route 445 northbound. I can hear you, but barely. What's your location? Are you in distress?" He released the key and waited, but the voices continued their desperate pleas without acknowledging his transmission. A third voice joined the supernatural chorus, this one belonging to a young man who sounded terrified. "The car won't start. Water's rising fast. We're gonna drown out here. Please, somebody help us. We're at the big rock, the one that looks like a pyramid." Danny realized with growing horror that he was listening to people who had died at Pyramid Lake. Their final radio transmissions somehow preserved in the electromagnetic field around the ancient waters. The lake had a dark history of drowning and accidents, stories that went back decades and included both Native Americans and white settlers who had underestimated the power of the sacred waters. The voices continued throughout his drive along the lake's shore, sometimes in English, sometimes in native languages, sometimes in what sounded like Spanish or other languages he couldn't identify. All of them carried the same themes: people lost in storms, trapped by rising waters, calling for help that never came. It was as if the lake itself had become a repository for the final communications of those who had died in its vicinity, their desperate last words echoing endlessly through the radio waves. As Danny passed the iconic tufa formation that gave Pyramid Lake its name, the voices on his radio reached a crescendo. Dozens of different speakers seemed to be broadcasting simultaneously, creating a supernatural chorus of the doomed and the lost. Some spoke of drowning, others of being lost in blizzards, still others of car accidents on the icy highway. But all of them shared the common thread of dying alone and afraid near the shores of the ancient lake. The most disturbing transmission came from a voice that sounded eerily similar to Danny's own. "This is Desert Runner on 445 southbound," the voice said, using the CB handle that Danny himself had used for years before switching to Mountain Express. "Lost control on the ice, trucks going into the lake. Can't get out of the cab, water's coming in fast. Tell my family I love them." Danny's blood turned to ice as he realized he was hearing his own voice, or rather, the voice of a version of himself who had died on this very highway. It was as if the lake was showing him a possible future, a potential fate that awaited him if he wasn't careful on this treacherous stretch of road. The voice continued its desperate final transmission, describing details of a crash that felt all too real and plausible. "Please," his own voice pleaded through the radio static, "don't let them forget me. Don't let them think I was just another careless trucker. I tried to stop, but the ice, the lake is so cold, so dark." Danny pulled over at the first safe spot he could find, a small turnout that overlooked the lake's dark waters. He sat in his idling truck, listening to the ghostly voices continue their eternal broadcast of desperation and loss. The wind from the approaching storm rocked his trailer, and snow began to dust his windshield, creating the same dangerous conditions that had claimed so many lives on this highway. The rational part of Danny's mind searched for explanations: atmospheric conditions caused by the storm, radio waves bouncing off the lake's surface, some kind of electronic interference from mining operations in the area. But deep down, he knew he was experiencing something that couldn't be explained by conventional science. He was hearing the preserved echoes of human tragedy, the final words of people who had died in the vicinity of this sacred lake. The voices began to fade as the storm moved closer, their ghostly transmissions gradually being overwhelmed by the static of lightning and electromagnetic interference from the approaching weather front. But just before they disappeared entirely, Danny heard one final transmission that chilled him to the bone. "The lake remembers," said a voice that seemed to speak from the depths of centuries rather than decades. "Every soul that has passed beneath its waters, every spirit that has joined the eternal silence. The lake remembers, and on nights like this, when the veil between worlds grows thin, it shares those memories with those who have the wisdom to listen." The radio fell silent except for the natural static of the storm, and Danny realized that he had been chosen to witness something sacred and terrible. The voices he'd heard weren't just random transmissions or electromagnetic anomalies. They were the preserved final words of people who had become part of the lake's spiritual ecosystem, their souls absorbed into the ancient waters that the Paiute people had revered for thousands of years. Danny completed his journey to Gerlach without further incident, but he was deeply shaken by his encounter with the radio voices of Pyramid Lake. He researched the history of the area and found dozens of accounts of drownings, accidents, and mysterious disappearances dating back to the earliest days of white settlement. Many of the victims had been found with their radios still broadcasting, their final transmissions preserved in police reports and rescue logs. From that night forward, Danny avoided Route 445 during storm conditions, always choosing longer routes that took him around the lake rather than along its shores. He'd learned that some places hold more than just water and rock. They hold the accumulated spiritual energy of all the lives that have ended within their boundaries. And Pyramid Lake, with its ancient waters and sacred significance, had become a repository for the voices of the lost, broadcasting their eternal messages to anyone with the sensitivity to receive them. Ray Martinez had picked up hitchhikers exactly 3 times in his 21-year trucking career, and each time he'd regretted it within minutes. Hitchhikers were unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and always seemed to have more problems than any reasonable person could handle. So when he spotted a figure with an extended thumb standing beside Highway 95 just south of the ghost town of Goldfield on a frigid December night in 2019, his first instinct was to keep driving. But something about the person's posture, the way they stood perfectly still in the sub-freezing desert air, made Ray slow down despite his better judgment. Ray was hauling electronics from Phoenix to Reno, running about 2 hours behind schedule due to a delayed loading dock in Arizona. The temperature had dropped to nearly 15 degrees, unusual for the Nevada desert even in December, and a bitter wind was gusting across the highway hard enough to rock his fully loaded trailer. It was the kind of night when being stranded on the roadside could quickly become a matter of life and death. The figure standing beside the highway was bundled in what appeared to be an old military surplus parka, with the hood pulled up against the wind. As Ray's headlights illuminated the scene, he could see that the hitchhiker was holding a small cardboard sign that read "Reno" in black marker. The person's posture was oddly rigid, standing at attention like a soldier, and they didn't wave or make any gestures to attract attention. Just stood with their thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's signal. Ray's conscience got the better of his caution. Nobody deserved to freeze to death on a deserted highway, regardless of their circumstances. He began to slow down, pulling onto the shoulder about 50 feet past the hitchhiker. In his mirrors, he could see the figure begin walking toward his truck with measured, deliberate steps that seemed strangely formal for someone who had just been offered a ride. The hitchhiker approached the passenger side of the cab and knocked on the door with what sounded like unusual force. Ray reached across and opened the door, expecting to see a grateful face and hear a story about car trouble or being stranded. Instead, he found himself looking at a young man in his early 20s wearing what appeared to be a complete military uniform from the 1950s. The uniform was in perfect condition, as if it had just come from the supply depot, but it was clearly decades out of date. "Thank you for stopping," the young man said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent and a formal politeness that seemed almost old-fashioned. "I need to get to Reno. It's very important that I make it there by morning." He climbed into the passenger seat with precise military movements, placing a small duffel bag on the floor between his feet. Ray studied his passenger more closely as he pulled back onto the highway. The young man was clean-shaven with short-cropped hair that looked like a regulation military cut. His uniform bore the insignia of the U.S. Army, with patches and ribbons that Ray didn't recognize but that looked authentic. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue and completely calm, showing none of the relief or gratitude that Ray would have expected from someone who had just been rescued from freezing temperatures. "Cold night to be hitchhiking," Ray observed, trying to start a conversation. "Car breakdown." "Something like that," the young man replied, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "I've been traveling for quite some time, longer than I expected when I started." There was something odd about his speech pattern, a careful precision that suggested English wasn't his first language, even though his accent was clearly American. Ray tried several more conversational gambits, but his passenger responded with only brief, polite answers that didn't invite further discussion. The young man sat with military posture, hands folded in his lap, occasionally checking what appeared to be an antique pocket watch that he pulled from his uniform jacket. The watch itself was strange. It seemed to be running, but the hands moved in a way that didn't correspond to normal time, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down, sometimes moving backward. About 20 miles north of Goldfield, Ray began to notice that the temperature gauge on his dashboard was reading much lower than normal. Despite having the heater running full blast, the cab was becoming uncomfortably cold, and he could see his breath forming small clouds when he spoke. His passenger didn't seem affected by the cold at all, showing no signs of shivering or discomfort despite the dropping temperature. "You warm enough?" Ray asked, reaching to adjust the heater controls. "I'm fine," the young man replied. "The cold doesn't bother me anymore. I've gotten used to it over the years." He continued to stare straight ahead, and Ray noticed that his passenger cast no reflection in the rearview mirror, despite sitting directly in its line of sight. Ray's unease was growing by the mile. Something was definitely wrong with his passenger, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. The military uniform, the formal speech patterns, the strange watch, the lack of reflection. Individually, these might have been quirks or coincidences, but together they suggested something far more unsettling. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" Ray said, trying to sound casual despite his growing nervousness. "Private First Class David Thompson, U.S. Army." The young man replied with the crisp precision of someone giving his name, rank, and serial number. "I'm returning from leave to report to my commanding officer at Reno Army Depot. I have important information about the test site operations." Ray's blood ran cold. The Reno Army Depot had been closed for decades, and there hadn't been any significant test site operations in Nevada since the atmospheric nuclear testing ended in the early 1960s. Either his passenger was deeply confused about current events, or Ray had picked up someone who existed outside the normal flow of time. "What year do you think it is?" Ray asked carefully, Private Thompson turned to look at him directly for the first time since getting in the truck. His pale blue eyes held a sadness that seemed to span decades, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated years. "I know what year you think it is," he said, "but time works differently for some of us. I've been making this same trip for over 60 years, trying to deliver my report, trying to complete my mission. But I never seem to arrive." Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the full implications of his passenger's words sank in. He had picked up a ghost, the spirit of a soldier who had died decades ago, but was still trying to complete his final assignment. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, Ray felt a profound sadness for this young man who had been trapped in an endless loop of duty and responsibility. "What happened to you?" Ray asked gently. Private Thompson was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape that looked exactly the same as it had in the 1950s. "I was a communications specialist," he finally said. "We were monitoring some of the atmospheric tests at the Nevada test site. I saw things, recorded things that the brass didn't want the public to know about. Radiation levels, wind patterns, contamination spreads, data that showed the tests were more dangerous than anyone was admitting." He pulled a manila folder from his duffel bag, and Ray could see that it was filled with official-looking documents and photographs. "I was driving to Reno to deliver this to a contact at the Army Depot, someone who was going to help me get it to the right people in Washington. But there was an accident." His voice trailed off, and he stared down at the folder in his hands. "You never made it to Reno," Ray said, understanding. "Single-car accident just south of Goldfield," Private Thompson confirmed. "Icy roads, lost control, rolled the car into a ravine, died instantly according to the report. But my mission wasn't complete. The information I was carrying was too important to die with me, so I kept trying to deliver it, kept trying to find someone who would take it to the right people." Ray looked at the documents his passenger was holding and realized he was seeing classified military information from over 60 years ago. Data that might have changed the course of nuclear testing if it had reached its intended destination. But now, decades later, the information was more historical curiosity than urgent intelligence. "The world has changed," Ray said carefully. "Atmospheric nuclear testing ended in the 1960s. The information you're carrying, it's not secret anymore. Historians and scientists have access to most of it now." Private Thompson nodded slowly, as if he had suspected as much but had been afraid to accept it. "I know," he said. "Part of me has always known, but I took an oath to complete my mission, and I've been trying to honor that oath ever since. Even in death, a soldier's duty doesn't end." They drove in silence for several miles, the weight of 60 years of unfulfilled duty filling the cab like a physical presence. Ray found himself deeply moved by this young man's dedication. His refusal to abandon his post even after death had released him from all earthly obligations. As they approached the outskirts of Reno, Private Thompson began to look more transparent, his solid form becoming translucent like morning mist. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice now coming from a great distance. "Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for treating me like a human being instead of just another ghost on the highway." "What will happen to you now?" Ray asked. Private Thompson smiled for the first time since getting in the truck, and his face looked younger, more peaceful. "Maybe it's time to stop trying to complete a mission that no longer matters. Maybe it's time to report to a different commanding officer, one who's been waiting for me to come home for over 60 years. As the lights of Reno appeared on the horizon, Private Thompson faded away entirely, leaving only the manila folder on the passenger seat as evidence that he had ever been there. Ray pulled over and examined the documents, finding himself looking at genuine classified materials from the early days of nuclear testing. information that had indeed been suppressed for decades but was now available in government archives and historical collections. Ray donated the documents to the Nevada Historical Society, where they were authenticated and added to the state's nuclear testing archive. But more importantly, he had given a lonely soldier the audience he needed to finally tell his story and release himself from a duty that had bound his spirit to the Nevada highways for over 6 decades. Ray still drives Highway 95 regularly, and sometimes on cold desert nights near Goldfield, he slows down when he sees hitchhikers on the roadside. Not because he's likely to pick them up, but because he's learned that sometimes the people who need rides aren't looking for transportation to earthly destinations. They're looking for someone who will listen to their stories and help them find their way to whatever comes after a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Carl Peterson had been driving the graveyard shift for most of his 18-year trucking career, and he'd always preferred the quiet solitude of night driving to the chaos and stress of daytime traffic. But on a moonless January night in 2022, while hauling computer equipment from California to Colorado via Highway 6 through central Nevada, Carl would encounter a convoy that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. Carl was making good time through the Nevada desert, running about an hour ahead of schedule despite the light snow that had been falling intermittently for the past 50 miles. Highway 6 was one of the lonelier cross-country routes, a 2-lane road that saw relatively little traffic compared to the interstates, especially in the middle of winter. It was the kind of road where you might drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, which made what Carl was about to experience all the more unsettling. Around 2:30 a.m., somewhere between the tiny settlements of Warm Springs and Current, Carl noticed lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he assumed it was another truck, probably another driver taking the scenic route to avoid interstate construction delays. But as the lights grew closer, Carl realized there wasn't just one vehicle behind him. There were several, traveling in a tight convoy formation that was unusual for civilian traffic. The lead vehicle appeared to be a large truck, followed by at least 4 or 5 others, all maintaining precisely spaced intervals and traveling at exactly the same speed. Their headlights were unusually bright, creating a moving constellation of white light that cut through the snowy darkness like a supernatural parade. What struck Carl as particularly odd was the perfect uniformity of their formation. Most truckers travel in loose groups for safety and companionship, but this convoy moved with military precision. Carl tried to get a better look through his mirrors, but the intensity of their headlights made it impossible to see details of the vehicles themselves. The lights seemed to float in the darkness, disconnected from any earthly machines, and they cast strange shadows that didn't align with the surrounding landscape. More unsettling, the convoy made no sound that Carl could detect, even when he rolled down his window to listen. There was no engine noise, no tire noise, no air brake hiss, just the eerie silence of vehicles that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of physics. The convoy maintained its position about a quarter mile behind Carl for nearly 20 miles, matching his speed with supernatural precision. When he accelerated to pass a slow-moving vehicle, they accelerated. When he slowed down for a curve, they slowed down. It was as if they were connected to his truck by invisible cables, following his every movement with mechanical accuracy. Carl grabbed his CB handset and keyed the mic, "Breaker 19. This is Knight Rider eastbound on Highway 6 near mile marker 40. Got a convoy behind me. Wondering if you folks are monitoring this channel." He waited for a response, but heard only static. He tried several other channels, but none of the convoy vehicles responded to his calls. As they passed through the ghost town of Current, Carl noticed something that made his blood run cold. The convoy vehicles were beginning to spread out, taking positions beside and ahead of his truck as if they were escorting him through hostile territory. He could now see that there were at least 8 vehicles in the ghostly procession: trucks, cars, and what appeared to be military vehicles, all traveling in perfect formation despite the obvious differences in their size and configuration. The temperature inside Carl's cab began to drop despite his heater running normally. Frost started forming on his windows, and his breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. The CB radio began picking up faint transmissions that sounded like military communications, coded messages, coordinates, and references to operations and unit designations that Carl didn't recognize. One transmission came through clearly enough for Carl to understand. Phantom Base, this is Convoy Alpha. We have civilian traffic in the operational area, requesting instructions for escort protocol. The voice was crisp and professional, but it carried a strange echo that made it sound like it was coming from a great distance or through layers of interference. Another voice responded, Convoy Alpha. Maintain formation and escort civilian traffic through the restricted zone. Do not deviate from established route. Mission parameters remain classified. The transmission was followed by a burst of static that almost sounded like encrypted data being transmitted. Carl realized he was listening to military communications from what appeared to be a classified operation, but there were no active military installations in this part of Nevada, and certainly no classified operations that would involve a convoy on Highway 6. The nearest military facility was hundreds of miles away, and this remote highway was about as far from strategic importance as you could get in the continental United States. As the convoy continued its supernatural escort, Carl began to notice details about the individual vehicles that defied logical explanation. The truck closest to his position appeared to be a 1960s-era military transport, complete with canvas covering and military markings, but it was in perfect condition despite obviously being decades old. Another vehicle looked like a civilian sedan from the same era, but it was traveling at highway speeds without any visible means of propulsion. No exhaust, no engine noise, no signs of mechanical operation. The most disturbing vehicle in the convoy was what appeared to be an ambulance, its red cross markings clearly visible in Carl's headlights. Through its rear windows, Carl could see shapes that looked like covered gurneys, and occasionally, a pale hand or face would appear at the window, pressed against the glass as if trying to communicate with the outside world. The ambulance maintained its position in the convoy formation, but it seemed to carry an aura of sadness and desperation that was palpable even through the desert air. The CB radio crackled with another transmission. All units, we are approaching the incident site. Maintain radio silence until further notice. Remember, this operation never happened. These people were never here. The voice carried a tone of grim authority that suggested terrible knowledge and heavy responsibility. Carl looked ahead and saw that they were approaching a section of highway that looked different from the surrounding road. The asphalt appeared newer, darker, as if it had been recently repaired or replaced. As they passed over this section, Carl felt a strange sensation, as if he were driving through a cold pocket of air that existed independently of the winter weather. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, but it left him with the distinct impression that something tragic had happened at this exact spot. The convoy began to slow as they passed the repaired section of highway, and Carl could see figures standing beside the road in the snowy darkness. They appeared to be wearing military uniforms and civilian clothes from the 1960s, and they watched the passing convoy with expressions of infinite sadness. Some raised their hands in farewell gestures, while others simply stood at attention, like soldiers honoring their fallen comrades. One figure, a young woman in a 1960s style dress, stepped closer to the road as Carl's truck passed. In the brief moment his headlights illuminated her face, Carl could see that she was transparent, her features clearly visible but lacking the solid presence of a living person. She mouthed words that Carl couldn't hear, but her expression was one of desperate urgency, as if she were trying to communicate something important about the mysterious convoy and the incident that had brought them all together. The CB radio burst to life with a final transmission. Mission complete. All units return to base. And remember, officially, this never happened. These people sacrificed their lives for national security, and that secret dies with us. The transmission was followed by complete silence, and Carl realized that the convoy vehicles were beginning to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Within minutes, Carl found himself alone on Highway 6, with no evidence that the supernatural convoy had ever existed except for the rapidly fading frost on his windows and the lingering cold in his cab. The highway returned to its normal appearance, and the only sounds were his engine and the whisper of snow against his windshield. Carl completed his journey to Colorado in a daze, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. When he returned home, he spent hours researching the history of Highway 6 in central Nevada, looking for any incident that might explain the ghostly convoy. What he found was a heavily redacted government document from 1963, declassified decades later, that referenced a transportation accident involving classified materials on Highway 6 near the town of Current. The document provided no details about the nature of the accident or the classified materials involved, but it did mention that all personnel involved in the incident were sworn to secrecy under national security provisions, and that the site was remediated and returned to normal highway conditions. Reading between the lines, Carl realized he had witnessed the eternal reenactment of a covered-up government accident, a tragedy that had been hidden from the public but whose victims continued to patrol that stretch of highway, ensuring that their sacrifice was not completely forgotten. Carl still drives Highway 6 occasionally, but he's never again encountered the midnight convoy. However, he's learned to pay attention to his CB radio when driving through central Nevada, and sometimes on clear winter nights, he picks up faint transmissions that sound like military communications from decades past. He's come to understand that some secrets are too heavy to stay buried, and some duties continue long after the official mission has ended and the classified files have been sealed away in government vaults. Maria Santos had been driving trucks for 12 years, one of the few female owner-operators specializing in high-value cargo transport in the western states. She prided herself on her professionalism, her punctuality, and her ability to handle any route, any weather, and any challenge the road could present. But on a fog-shrouded October night in 2021, while navigating the treacherous curves of Highway 431 between Reno and Lake Tahoe, Maria would encounter something that would test not only her driving skills, but her understanding of the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. Maria was hauling a load of luxury automobiles from a dealer in Sacramento to a high-end showroom in Carson City, taking the scenic route through the Sierra Nevada mountains because the main highways were closed due to an early-season snowstorm. Highway 431, also known as the Mount Rose Highway, was a challenging drive under the best conditions, with steep grades and hairpin turns that wound through mountain forests and past pristine alpine lakes. In heavy fog with temperatures dropping toward freezing, it was a route that demanded absolute concentration and respect. The fog had rolled in just after sunset, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet and creating an otherworldly landscape where familiar landmarks disappeared into gray nothingness. Maria had slowed to 30 miles per hour, using her fog lights and following the reflective lane markers with the precision of a pilot navigating by instruments. The only sounds were the steady rumble of her diesel engine and the whisper of fog swirling past her windshield. About halfway up the mountain, near the turnoff to Mount Rose ski area, Maria began to hear something that didn't belong in the mechanical symphony of truck and highway. It was a sound so faint at first that she thought it might be wind through the trees or the distant call of night birds. But as she continued climbing through the fog-shrouded curves, the sound became clearer and more distinct. It was a woman crying. The crying wasn't the brief sobs of momentary sadness or the angry tears of frustration. This was the deep, heartbroken weeping of someone experiencing profound loss, the kind of grief that comes from losing a child or watching a life's dreams crumble into nothing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the fog-hidden canyon walls and penetrating the sealed cab of Maria's truck as if the sorrow itself could pass through steel and glass. Maria rolled down her window, thinking perhaps she would hear better and be able to locate the source of the crying. The fog immediately began to seep into the cab, bringing with it an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the October mountain air. The weeping became louder and more distinct, and Maria realized it was coming from somewhere ahead of her on the highway, as if she were driving toward its source. As she navigated another sharp curve, her headlights briefly illuminated a figure standing beside the road. It was a woman in what appeared to be a white dress or nightgown, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still in the swirling fog, and even at a distance, Maria could see that she was the source of the heartbroken crying that had been following her up the mountain. Maria's first instinct was to stop and offer help. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and standing outside in nothing but a thin dress could quickly become fatal in these conditions. But something about the woman's posture, the way she stood without moving despite the cold and fog, triggered a warning instinct that made Maria hesitate. As her truck drew closer, Maria could see more details of the figure beside the road. The woman appeared to be young, perhaps in her 20s, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the fog. Her white dress was old-fashioned, like something from the early 1900s, and it showed no signs of being affected by the wind that was causing the fog to swirl and shift around her. Most unsettling, the woman cast no shadow despite standing directly in the beam of Maria's headlights. Maria slowed to a crawl as she passed the weeping woman, and for a brief moment, their eyes met through the fog. What Maria saw in that ghostly face would haunt her for the rest of her life. The woman's eyes held a grief so profound it seemed to contain decades of accumulated sorrow, and her expression was one of desperate longing mixed with terrible resignation. She was beautiful in the way that antique photographs are beautiful, but there was something ethereal about her features that suggested she existed outside the normal flow of time and space. The weeping woman raised one pale hand as Maria's truck passed, not in greeting but in a gesture that seemed to plead for something. Attention, acknowledgement, or perhaps simply someone to witness her eternal sorrow. Maria wanted to stop, wanted to help, but every instinct screamed at her to keep driving, to not become involved in whatever supernatural tragedy was playing out in the fog-shrouded mountains. As Maria continued up the highway, the weeping followed her, sometimes seeming to come from behind her truck, sometimes from ahead, and sometimes from all around her as if the fog itself were filled with the sound of inconsolable grief. The temperature inside her cab continued to drop despite her heater running at full capacity, and frost began forming on her windows in patterns that looked almost like tears frozen in place. The CB radio in Maria's truck began picking up static that almost sounded like whispered words. She adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but the static persisted, sometimes resolving into what sounded like a woman's voice speaking in Spanish. Maria, who was fluent in Spanish, strained to make out the words, and what she heard made her hands shake on the steering wheel. "Mis niños," the voice whispered through the static. "Dónde están mis niños?" The words repeated like a mantra, growing clearer and more desperate with each repetition. "My children, where are my children?" Maria realized she was hearing the voice of the weeping woman, somehow transmitted through her CB radio despite the impossibility of such a thing. The voice continued its desperate plea, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English, always asking the same heartbreaking question about missing children. As Maria navigated another series of curves, her headlights revealed something that made her slam on the brakes. The weeping woman was now standing directly in the center of the highway, her white dress flowing around her despite the absence of any wind. She stood with her arms outstretched, as if she were trying to stop traffic or embrace someone who wasn't there. Maria brought her truck to a complete stop about 20 feet from the ghostly figure. Through her windshield, she could see the woman's face clearly now, and it was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. Her features were delicate and refined, but her eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had lost everything that gave life meaning. Tears flowed continuously down her pale cheeks, and when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice carried clearly through the fog-muffled night. "Have you seen them?" the woman asked in accented English, her voice carrying the same desperate hope and crushing disappointment that Maria had heard in the radio static. "My children, they were supposed to be with me. We were going to start a new life together, but they never came. Have you seen them?" Maria found her voice enough to respond through her open window. "I'm sorry, I haven't seen any children. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" But even as she spoke, she knew that whatever this woman needed was beyond anything Maria could provide. The weeping woman moved closer to the truck, her movements fluid and ethereal, as if she were floating rather than walking. "They promised they would follow," she continued, her voice now filled with a despair that seemed to echo through the mountain canyon. "My husband said he would bring the children after he settled his affairs, but that was so long ago. I've been waiting and waiting, but they never come." Maria realized she was talking to a ghost, the spirit of a woman who had died waiting for a reunion that never happened. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, Maria felt overwhelming sadness for this lost soul who had spent decades, perhaps centuries, searching for children who might never have existed or who had died long ago. "What's your name?" Maria asked gently, treating the supernatural encounter with the respect and compassion she would show any grieving person. "Isabella," the woman replied, her ghostly form now close enough to the truck that Maria could see the intricate embroidery on her antique dress. "Isabella Mendoza. I came here from Mexico in 1918, following the promise of work and a better life. My husband was supposed to send for the children once I found employment, but the influenza came and Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her translucent hands as if seeing them for the first time. Maria's heart broke for this woman who had died nearly a century ago, still waiting for a reunion that would never come. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had killed millions worldwide, and many immigrant families had been separated by death before they could be reunited. Isabella had died waiting for her children, and her spirit had been trapped on this mountain highway ever since, searching for the family that would never arrive. "Isabella," Maria said softly, "your children, they're not coming. Too much time has passed. You need to let them go." The weeping woman's expression changed from desperate hope to crushing realization. "I know," she whispered, her voice now barely audible over the fog-muffled silence. "Part of me has always known, but if I stop waiting, if I stop watching for them, who will remember that they existed? Who will remember that we were supposed to be a family?" Maria felt tears running down her own cheeks as she struggled to find words of comfort for a grief that had lasted nearly a century. "They're remembered," she said finally, "by you, by your love for them. That kind of love doesn't die even when everything else does." Isabella nodded slowly, and for the first time since Maria had encountered her, the ghostly woman seemed to find a moment of peace. "Perhaps it's time," she said, her voice growing fainter as her form began to become more translucent. "Perhaps it's time to stop waiting and start looking for them in the place where all waiting ends." As the fog began to lift with the approach of dawn, Isabella's form faded like morning mist, her final words echoing through the mountain air. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me as more than just another ghost on the highway." The weeping that had followed Maria up the mountain finally ceased, replaced by the natural sounds of wind through pine trees and the distant call of early birds welcoming the sunrise. Maria sat in her truck for several minutes as the fog cleared, processing what she had experienced. When she finally resumed her journey down the mountain toward Carson City, she found herself thinking about all the immigrants who had died far from home, separated from their families by circumstances beyond their control. Isabella Mendoza was just one of millions who had sacrificed everything for the promise of a better life, only to die before her dreams could be realized. Maria completed her delivery without further incident, but she never forgot her encounter with the weeping woman of Lake Tahoe Highway. She researched Isabella's story and found records of a young Mexican woman who had died of influenza in a work camp near Lake Tahoe in 1918, leaving behind a husband and 3 children in Mexico who never learned of her fate. Maria arranged for a small memorial plaque to be placed at the site where she had encountered Isabella's ghost, ensuring that at least one person would remember the woman who had waited nearly a century for a reunion that could never happen in this world. Thomas "Big Tom" Wagner had been driving 18-wheelers for 27 years, covering over 3 million miles without a single major accident or serious citation. He knew every truck stop, rest area, and diesel island from coast to coast, could navigate by landmark and intuition as well as any GPS system. But on his final run before retirement, a bittersweet journey from Seattle to Miami carrying a load of specialized medical equipment, Tom would discover a rest stop that didn't appear on any map or in any trucker's guide. A place that existed at the crossroads between the world of the living and whatever comes after. It was mid-March 2023, and Tom was taking his time on this last cross-country haul, savoring the familiar rhythms of the road that had defined his adult life. He'd planned a route through Nevada partly for the scenery and partly for the memories. Some of his earliest runs as a young driver had taken him through the Silver State, and he wanted to see it one more time before hanging up his keys for good. Tom was driving eastbound on Interstate 80, somewhere between Reno and Winnemucca, when he noticed he was getting low on fuel. According to his GPS and his mental map of the route, the next truck stop should be about 40 miles ahead, but his fuel gauge was indicating he might not make it that far with a full load. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree and the shimmering heat mirages that made the asphalt look like it was covered in water. As he crested a small hill, Tom saw something that surprised him. A rest stop that he didn't remember from previous trips through this area. It was a full-service facility with diesel pumps, a restaurant, and what appeared to be a small motel, all built in a style that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. The neon sign read "Last Chance Truck Stop" in faded red letters, and several big rigs were parked in the lot, their drivers presumably inside getting food or rest. Tom pulled off the interstate and into the truck stop, grateful for the unexpected opportunity to fuel up and take a break. As he maneuvered his rig toward the diesel island, he noticed that all the other trucks in the lot were older models, classic Peterbilts, Kenworths, and Macs from the 1970s and 1980s, all in pristine condition despite their obvious age. It was like stepping into a museum of trucking history, and Tom felt a nostalgic appreciation for the craftsmanship and character of the older rigs. The diesel pumps were old-fashioned mechanical units without digital displays or credit card readers, the kind that required you to go inside and prepay or arrange credit with the cashier. Tom walked toward the restaurant, a low-slung building with large windows that glowed with warm, yellow light. Through the glass, he could see drivers sitting at tables and counter stools, eating and talking in the comfortable camaraderie that characterized truck stop culture. The bell above the door chimed as Tom entered, and he was immediately struck by the atmosphere inside. The restaurant looked exactly like truck stops had looked in the early days of his career. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with rotating stools, a jukebox playing classic country music, and the comfortable clutter of a place that had been serving road-weary travelers for decades. The drivers inside were all middle-aged or older, dressed in the flannel shirts and jeans that were the unofficial uniform of the trucking profession. "Welcome to Last Chance," said the waitress behind the counter. A pleasant-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and a genuine smile. "You must be Tom Wagner. We've been expecting you." Tom was surprised that she knew his name, but figured it must be the kind of small-town friendliness that still existed in rural Nevada. "Yes, ma'am. Tom Wagner. I need to fuel up and was hoping I could get some coffee and maybe a bite to eat." "Of course," the waitress replied. "Take any seat you like. Coffee's fresh, and the apple pie is still warm from the oven." She poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, and Tom noticed that her movements had a timeless quality, as if she had been performing these same actions for decades. Tom took a seat at the counter and looked around at his fellow drivers. They all had the weathered faces and calloused hands that came from years on the road, and they greeted him with the casual nods and brief words that constituted trucker social protocol. But there was something unusual about their conversations. They spoke about highways that had been decommissioned decades ago, trucking companies that had gone out of business in the 1980s, and regulations that had been changed years before Tom had even gotten his CDL. "You boys talking about the old days?" Tom asked, sipping his coffee and enjoying the familiar comfort of truck stop conversation. An older driver with a gray beard and a faded Peterbilt cap looked up from his apple pie. "Every day's the old days here, son. Time moves different at last chance. Always has." He gestured toward the window, where Tom could see the classic trucks parked under the neon lights. "Most of us have been stopping here for years. Decades, some of us." Another driver, this one wearing a Freightliner jacket from a company Tom remembered going bankrupt in the early 1990s, joined the conversation. "Last chance is where you end up when your regular routes don't need you anymore. When the new trucks and the young drivers take over the highways you used to call home." Tom felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the restaurant. There was something in the way these men spoke, a resigned acceptance that suggested they weren't just talking about changing times in the trucking industry. "How long have you all been coming here?" he asked. "Time's funny here," the bearded driver replied. "Could be days, could be years. Doesn't matter much when you're not in a hurry to get anywhere." He studied Tom with eyes that held decades of road experience. "But you're different. You're still on the clock, still got somewhere to be. This is just a stop for you, not a destination." The waitress refilled Tom's coffee and placed a slice of apple pie in front of him without being asked. "Tom's on his final run," she said, as if she knew details about his life that he'd never shared. 27 years on the road, and he's earned his rest. "But he's not ready for it yet, are you, Tom?" Tom stared at the pie, his appetite suddenly gone. "How do you know about my retirement? I haven't told anyone here about that." "Word travels fast on the highway," another driver said from a booth near the window, "especially when it's about one of the good ones. 27 years without a major accident, always on time, always professional. That kind of record gets noticed." Tom looked around the restaurant more carefully, and details that had seemed charmingly nostalgic now took on a more unsettling quality. The jukebox was playing songs he recognized, but they were versions he'd never heard before, as if they were being performed by the original artists in some eternal concert. The clock on the wall showed different times depending on the angle from which he viewed it, and the windows revealed a landscape that seemed to shift between day and night with no regard for the actual passage of time. "What is this place?" Tom asked quietly. The bearded driver smiled sadly. "Last chance is exactly what the name says. The last chance for drivers who can't quite let go of the road. Some of us died at the wheel, heart attacks or accidents. Others just couldn't adjust to retirement, couldn't find meaning in a life without 18 wheels and diesel engines. We end up here, in between destinations, still making runs that never quite end." Tom's hands were shaking as he reached for his coffee cup. "Are you saying you're all dead? Dead? Retired? Forgotten? What's the difference?" Another driver said from the counter. The road doesn't care about the details. It just knows when a driver belongs on it and when they don't. Most of us here, we belong on the road more than we ever belonged anywhere else. The waitress placed a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder. Don't be afraid, Tom. You're not like us. You still have a choice. You can finish your run, deliver your load, and find peace in retirement. Or you can stay here with us, where every day is another chance to feel the road beneath your wheels and the diesel engine's heartbeat in your chest. Tom looked out the window at the classic trucks parked under the neon lights, their chrome gleaming and their diesel engines idling with the patient rumble of machines that never quite shut down. He could see drivers checking their loads, adjusting their mirrors, preparing for runs that would take them nowhere but back to this same truck stop. This same moment of eternal preparation for journeys that never truly began or ended. What happens if I stay? Tom asked. You become part of the convoy, the bearded driver explained. You keep making runs, keep driving the highways you love, but you're not bound by schedules or delivery dates anymore. Time stops being important. Distance becomes irrelevant. You just drive, and the road takes care of everything else. Tom felt the temptation strongly. The idea of endless highways with no traffic jams, no way stations, no electronic logbooks or hours of service regulations was appealing to someone who had spent nearly 3 decades navigating an increasingly complex and regulated industry. But something held him back. The memory of his wife waiting for him at home, the grandchildren he'd promised to teach to drive, the small house with the garden where he'd planned to spend his golden years. I can't, Tom said finally. I made promises to people who are still living. I have obligations that go beyond the road. The drivers nodded with understanding, and the waitress smiled approvingly. That's what makes you one of the good ones, Tom. You know when to hold on and when to let go. She refilled his coffee cup one last time. Finish your coffee, fuel up your truck, and complete your final run. But remember us, and remember that the road will always be here if you ever need to find it again. Tom drank his coffee slowly, savoring both the familiar taste and the strange comfort of being among drivers who understood the unique bond between a trucker and his rig. When he finally stood to leave, each of the drivers shook his hand and wished him well on his final journey. The bearded driver was the last to say goodbye. 27 years is a good run, Tom. Be proud of it. And when you're sitting in that garden of yours, missing the road, remember that some of us never got the chance to choose anything else. Make your retirement mean something. Tom paid for his coffee and pie with bills that the cashier accepted without comment, even though he noticed they were older denominations that hadn't been in circulation for years. He walked back to his truck under stars that seemed brighter than they should have been, and found that his fuel tank had been filled and his load secured, though he couldn't remember anyone working on his rig while he was inside. As Tom pulled back onto Interstate 80, he looked in his mirrors to see Last Chance truck stop fading into the desert night like a mirage in reverse. Within minutes, there was no sign that it had ever existed, just the endless Nevada highway stretching ahead toward the sunrise and his final destination. Tom completed his delivery in Miami without incident and drove his empty trailer back to the company terminal for the last time. He turned in his keys, cleaned out his cab, and said goodbye to the life that had defined him for over a quarter century. But he never forgot Last Chance truck stop or the drivers who had chosen to spend eternity making runs that led nowhere but back to the comfortable camaraderie of the road. Years later, in retirement, when Tom missed the highway more than he could bear, he would sometimes drive his pickup truck through the Nevada desert, looking for a truck stop that didn't appear on any map. He never found it again, but he took comfort in knowing it was out there somewhere, a place where the road never ended and the coffee was always fresh and hot. The stories you've just heard aren't just tales of the supernatural. They're reminders that the highways we travel are more than just asphalt and steel. They're repositories of human experience, witnesses to countless journeys, and sometimes bridges between the world we know and mysteries that exist just beyond our headlights' reach. For every mile of Nevada highway, there are stories like these, waiting in the darkness for the right driver to experience them. If these encounters have left you hungry for more tales from America's loneliest roads, then you won't want to miss our next chilling collection, 15 Real Rig Oil Worker Horror Stories. Deep in the remote oil fields where civilization ends and the wilderness begins, where workers spend months in isolation surrounded by dangerous machinery and unforgiving landscapes, even more terrifying encounters await. From ghostly figures stalking the drilling platforms to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation. These stories will take you into the heart of industrial horror, where the line between human ambition and otherworldly forces becomes dangerously thin.